Hey guys, it's Kevin in my review for The Tomorrow War. And this film basically centers on, it takes place in December 2022, so not that far from now, literally a year from now, where basically we center on this character, Dan Forrester. He is this biology teacher that's feeling rather unfulfilled in life, and basically one day there is this broadcast that ends up happening where basically we are told that, in the future, the humanity is on the brink of extinction. There's this huge, war with aliens that are going down known as the White Spikes, and humanity just seems kind of doomed. So basically, in an effort to hopefully resolve this issue, we see that a bunch of present-day soldiers and civilians are being sent into the future to fight this army, and Dan happens to be one of the few that is tasked with doing this. So the Tomorrow War overall, I was not really that excited for this film. Look, this is one of those movies where I really wanted to be excited for it, but it just looked really generic to me. It didn't really look like it was anything that special. It felt like a more lesser version of Edge of Tomorrow or something like that, and I just wasn't really feeling this film. And I also feel like with Amazon recently, I've talked about this, they just have not really been doing it for me in terms of originals. I think that while there have been some good ones this year, the majority of them have just not been all that great in terms of films, and I just have not really been that impressed by them. So I wasn't really, hoping for, I wasn't really expecting much from this movie overall. It just looked pretty generic and been there, done that to me. So I did finally check it out, and it's definitely better than I expected. I do think that The Tomorrow War is quite an enjoyable film and definitely does have a lot to like about it, but unfortunately, I do think it still falls kind of flat as a film, and I think it is lacking in quite a few areas to really leave a long-lasting impression on me overall, but we are just getting into right now. I will say one of the best things about this movie is the cast here. I think everyone does do a really good job, and I definitely was impressed by pretty much everyone in terms of acting. Let's first talk about Chris Pratt, because he is one of those actors that I think he's usually very likable in the role that he's in. I think he normally does a really good job, especially in things like the Lego Movie and Guardians of the Galaxy. He has really proven himself to be a great actor, and in this film, I do think he does a pretty good job as this character of Dan Forrester. He does add a few layers to this character, and he is overall quite likable. That being said, I don't think this is quite as good of a performance as he's given before. I think it's lacking in quite a few areas, and while I definitely did enjoy Pratt in the role, I just don't know if he fully went for it in the way that he needed to. There's a lot of emotional depth that this character goes through, and I don't really know if Pratt fully went all in, and I think that was definitely holding back the film for me a bit, but I think overall he definitely did do a really good job. But without a doubt, the clear standout in this movie has to be Yvonne Strahovski, who does, of course, play the character of the Colonel in this film, and there's a little bit more to her that I'm not gonna get into because that's not something you know going into this movie, but I thought she was fantastic here. She definitely did everything that I need her to. She starts off and she's a very stoic colonel. It seems like she's just kind of barking orders at people, and she's someone that is very adamant on making sure this gets done. But as the film goes on, you start to realize that there's a lot more to her character. She has a lot of challenging material, and she really does deliver in that way. I've always been a fan of Strahovski as an actress, and I think this is probably one of her best performances yet. I really like what she ended up doing here, and her and Chris Pratt have some really solid chemistry that I found myself really buying into, and I think they worked really well together, so I definitely like what she ended up doing in this film. As far as the rest cast goes, everyone does do a really good job. J.K. Simmons is always great in anything you put him in, and he definitely does a really good job here. He's got quite a few one-liners that I thought were really funny, and he, of course, is the estranged father of Dan, and I thought that he definitely did give a very memorable performance. Sam Richardson was definitely fun in this movie. I do think that he did a pretty good job here. And Edwin Hodge, I really did like as well. I thought he definitely, was really good as this character that he's done a bunch of these wars before. He's used to, a lot of this mayhem and things like that. This is just like another day at the office for him. And I thought that he definitely did stick out very well as that character. I think all the acting for the most part was really good here. Now let's get to the directing and the writing, because this is where we get to the things that unfortunately I think do bring down this film. Chris McKay as a director, I was very excited to see him take this on, because I do think he has proven himself to be a very good director before. He brought us the Lego Batman movie and things like that, and I was really interested in seeing how he was going to translate that to a much more serious, live action sci-fi action film. I didn't really know how it was going to go, and I think definitely he does some things right. I think that when it comes to the scope of this movie, when it comes to a lot of the more emotional aspects, he does a pretty good job with that, and I do think that he has a pretty good style overall. That being said, I think the balance of this film is just a little bit weird, because while the film definitely does dive into how dire of a situation this really is, there are a lot of moments of comedy, and none of them really worked for me. All of them fell very flat. It felt very awkward, and I don't think he did a very good job with it. I don't think his directing was quite as consistent as it really could have been, but I do think he has shown that he has a lot of talent in him, and I will always respect a director that tries to, go beyond what they're known for, that tries to do something that's a little bit more unorthodox in that way. I just don't know if it fully came together for McKay as a director overall, so I think his directing, while strong, wasn't quite as strong as it needed to be. Unfortunately, what really brings this movie down for me is the writing, which I'm not going to lie to you guys. When I first finished this movie, I was like, okay, that was a decent action flick. It definitely had a lot of issues, but I think I overall did enjoy it. But it's one of those films where the more I thought about it, the more flaws I kept realizing I had with it, the more issues really kept overshadowing everything else, and it really does come down to the screenplay, which I just don't think is very good here. My biggest issue with this movie easily is that there's just too much going on in this movie. And what I mean by that is, there's a lot of story that's happening in this film. It's a lot less simplistic than you think. There's a lot more going on underneath the surface. But the problem is there's so much going on to the point where I feel like a lot of it just isn't as well done as it should be. It's not that well written, because it almost feels like we have two movies stretched into one, and we have two movies that have essentially been cobbled together into this screenplay, and it just feels very messy overall. This is one of those movies where it very much does have a 3-act structure. The first act is very distinctive, the same with the second, and then the third is something of its own. And while I do like that approach, I think that it honestly robs the movie of really getting to tell this story to its full potential, because when it comes to the actual story we're dealing with here of all these soldiers and them going into war and them having to go up against these aliens, it just isn't very interesting to me. It happens very quickly, and a lot of these characters that we meet up with are just not all that memorable. Like I said, I enjoyed Edwin Hodge's character. I thought he was definitely someone that I latched onto and I thought was very interesting. And Sam Richardson's character, he's definitely got a lot of focus here as well. But he's very much the comedic relief in this film, and especially when you're dealing with a film that is literally world-ending circumstances, it just feels a little bit weird to have this humor in here. It doesn't really fit in the film overall, and I don't really know what it's doing there, but the larger issue is that it just feels really rushed. I will say, once you get more into it, and you start to really get to see these characters really going up against these threats, that's when I think the movie does get really good. And once we get to the second act and you start to realize more of what this movie is really all about, I think they do a better job with that, and that's something that I did overall appreciate in this film. It becomes more of this father-daughter type story, and that's something that I did latch onto here. They start to dive more into that aspect of the film, and I think that's where the film really does shine. I think there's a really good father-daughter story in here of, you know, our main character and him kind of realizing the regrets that he's going to have in his life and appreciating family more and things like that. And I think all of that is very effective, but that's immediately upended about 40 minutes later. And it feels like once the second act wraps up, it feels almost like the end of the movie. And it's really weird the way the movie is structured in that way. Something happens in this film, and I was like, oh, well, I guess we're almost done. That's a really effective ending, and I'm surprised they're ending it this way, but that's a really good way to wrap things up. And then you realize you have 40 minutes left, and those 40 minutes, you know, it's not that they're bad or anything, but it just feels unearned because it feels like it should be part of a different movie. I already heard they've announced a sequel to this film, and I don't understand why the last 40 minutes of this movie isn't the sequel, because to be honest, with the way things wrap up, I don't really know what else they can do when it comes to this movie. I feel like there was a lot of stuff that they could have dived further into in a second film, but we already saw it play out in this movie, and so they kind of just wasted a lot of that story potential, and I don't really know what they're even going to do with the story moving forward if they do choose to make that sequel, because like I said, from what I heard, a sequel's in development, and I just don't really know where else they can go with this story. So I don't think they did a very good job with it. I think the story is just very messily handled. Like I said, I think the second act is when the film really does shine. It becomes more of this, you know, really touching father-daughter story, and that's, I think, where the film definitely does get really good. But the first act and the third act especially are really clunky, and I think that definitely does bring the film down. It also doesn't help, though, that the main character in this movie of Dan Forrester is just not that interesting to me. I felt like this was a very generic character where, oh, he's unfulfilled in life. They have this thing in the beginning. The first scene is literally him calling into this job that he really wanted and not getting it, and then all of a sudden he's in this role and he's supposed to feel more fulfilled, but the problem is we just don't spend enough time on his individual journey. There isn't a lot going on with Dan as a character. And there's a revelation that happens in the second act of this movie, something he realizes might end up happening to him in the future. And I just didn't buy it. I didn't buy that this character would do this specific thing because we just didn't know enough about him. And I just felt like they needed to spend a lot more time on his individual development and not as much time on the plot itself, because the movie is so in a rush to get to the story, to get to the meat of things, and I don't understand why a movie that is as long as this one is feels the need to rush through important stuff like the character development. So Dan was just someone I never found myself really latching onto as a character, and by proxy, I also found J.K. Simmons' character to be very much lacking here too. One, he's not in the movie enough at all. He's in it like he has like 2 or 3 scenes the whole movie, but I think he should have had a lot more to do here, because it's clear when you get into this father-daughter storyline, they're kind of trying to parallel that with his relationship with his father, but we don't know enough about his relationship with his father, so I don't really feel like that parallel worked all that well, and I think that definitely does weigh the movie down considerably, and that definitely and that definitely did weigh down the movie quite a bit. The only character I really found myself latching onto overall was the Colonel in this movie, Yvonne Strahovski's character. I really liked her a lot, and I think that she had a considerable amount of depth to her. She had a lot of emotion to her. There's a genuine bond between her and Chris Pratt that you really do find yourself latching onto, and I thought that she was probably the best character in this movie. I would have much rather the film actually focused around her. I think that would have actually been more interesting than focusing around Dan, who I just never found myself latching onto because I just found him to be a very generic character overall. So again, I think there's a lot of good aspects in this film in terms of the story, but there's a lot of things that fall quite flat. Dan's wife as well. I didn't talk about Betty Gilpin because she's utterly wasted in this movie. She has nothing to really do here. She's just sort of like the concerned wife, and I I get that's her role, but Gilpin is such a talented actress that I feel like she needed a lot more to do than just that, and I really wish they would have given her a bigger purpose in this movie, because I kind of felt like you could have just cut her character out of the movie overall, and not much really would have changed, because she just didn't serve that much of a purpose other than we're just going to cut back to her every so often, you know, to see how concerned she is, and that just wasn't really enough for me. I just needed more to quite a few of these characters. There's another group that we center on as well that you don't really get to spend a lot of time with either, because they're not in the movie for that long. There's just a lot of aspects in terms of the story that I think generally fell very flat here, so I think the screenplay is very easily the worst thing about this movie. The one thing I will say that actually did impress me was the cinematography here. When I saw it in the trailer, I was a little bit iffy as to the look of everything, but it really does work quite well. You know, they really do play around a lot when it comes to the future aspect, but especially these creatures. I mean, these guys are generally threatening looking, and I really did feel like, you know, these are unstoppable, you know, forces. These are forces that could really compromise humanity, and you really do feel that in the film. The look of these, you know, the white spikes overall is generally very threatening, and there are a lot of action sequences that really stuck out here to me. There's one especially that happens right before the end of the first act, and it was nail-biting tension. I thought they did such a great job in terms of the action sequence, and I'm honestly surprised that the film didn't come to theaters, because for a movie that I thought, you know, had a considerably lower budget than it did, I actually thought they did a pretty good job in terms of the action sequences, so that was definitely one of the higher points of this film. And the score here by Lorna Balfe, I thought overall was really good. It was very memorable. It was definitely hooked me in terms of emotion, and I thought that he did a really good job. And the editing, I talked about this before, I just think this movie is too long. I think the movie is 138 minutes, and it doesn't take advantage of that runtime. Two, I just think there's too much going on in this movie. I think that the movie could have easily been 108 or something like that, or maybe even just a little over 2 hours, and I think that would have suited this movie more, because you would have had just enough to fully invest yourself in. But again, the movie is so concerned with rushing through all of these story developments and just trying to like throw everything at the wall and see what sticks, and only some of it really does work overall. And the way the movie wraps up as well, like I said, if there's supposed to be a second movie, I just don't really know what else they're gonna do, because I feel like the story of the second movie is in this movie, and I think that generally does hurt, you know, the second film going forward, because apparently they are going to make it. Overall, The Tomorrow War is not a bad film. It does have a lot of really good ideas to it. It has some strong performances from Yvonne Strahovski, especially. I thought she definitely did a really strong job here. There's some strong action set pieces. There are some really good ideas. There's a good father-daughter story that's in there, but overall, I just think this film was a little too overstuffed. There are a lot of ideas that the movie wants to get into, but I think some of them very much they could have waited until a second film, but unfortunately it's all crammed into one movie, and the experience overall just isn't that satisfying as a whole. Not to mention a very uninteresting lead character that I just had a very hard time latching onto. And you have a film that is a little bit better than I expected, but still isn't anything that great, isn't nearly as good as I think it really could have been. I think this could have generally been a really good and emotional film that dived into some really interesting aspects of humanity, but it just never fully went for it in terms of what I think it really wanted to. So overall, I was not that impressed by The Tomorrow War, and I am going to give it a C+. Over, guys, to my review of The Tomorrow War. Let me know what you guys saw this movie overall, left your thoughts, and we'll see you guys in my next video, and we'll see you guys for that. Okay, bye.